Anna had always hated the silence of her apartment after dark. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of it, the way it pressed against her chest, reminding her of everything she had lost. 2 years had passed since the accident, and though she had tried to move on, the nights were still the hardest. The empty side of the bed, the untouched coffee mug in the cabinet, the faint scent of his cologne that lingered in the closet, it all felt like a ghost haunting her. That night, she was curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, trying to distract herself with a book. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second dragging her closer to midnight. She didn't know why, but she had always felt uneasy around that time. Maybe it was because the accident had happened at exactly midnight, or maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her. When the phone rang, she nearly jumped out of her skin. The sound was sharp, intrusive, cutting through the silence like a knife. She hesitated, staring at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, a string of digits that didn't match any of her contacts. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello?" Her voice was tentative, barely above a whisper. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, she heard it, a low, ragged breathing. It was slow and deliberate, as if someone was deliberately exhaling into the receiver. Her stomach tightened, and she gripped the phone harder. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The breathing continued, unchanged. No words, no explanation, just that eerie, rhythmic sound. She felt a chill crawl up her spine, and her mind raced with possibilities. A prank call? A wrong number? But why did it feel so deliberate? "Stop it," she said, louder this time, though her voice wavered. "This isn't funny." The line went dead. She stared at the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. For a long moment, she sat there, frozen, the silence of the apartment now feeling even heavier than before. She told herself it was nothing, just a stupid prank, but the unease lingered, settling deep in her bones. That night, she slept with the lights on. The next night, Anna tried to convince herself it wouldn't happen again. She kept the TV on, the volume low but enough to fill the silence, and told herself the call had been a one-time thing. Maybe someone had dialed the wrong number, or it was a glitch in the system. She even considered calling her phone provider to report it, but the idea of explaining the incident felt silly. How could she describe something so vague, so unsettling, without sounding paranoid? But at exactly midnight, the phone rang again. This time, she was prepared, or so she thought. She had left it on the coffee table, far enough that she wouldn't be tempted to answer. But the sound was relentless, echoing through the room like a siren. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, her eyes darting to the screen. The same unknown number, the same eerie silence when she answered, followed by that same, unmistakable breathing. Except this time, there was something else. Faint, almost imperceptible, but there. A low hum in the background, like the rumble of an engine. It was distant, but it sent a jolt of recognition through her. She had heard that sound before, but where? Her mind raced, trying to place it, but the breathing drowned out her thoughts. "Who is this?" she asked again, her voice firmer this time, though her hands still shook. "What do you want?" The breathing paused, as if the person on the other end was considering her question. For a brief moment, she thought they might actually respond. But then the sound returned, louder now, more deliberate. And then, just like before, the call ended. Anna sat there, staring at the phone, her heart pounding. She felt a strange mix of anger and fear, a knot tightening in her stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was doing this on purpose. But why? And why at midnight? The next day, she decided to take action. She blocked the number, hoping that would be the end of it. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. There was something about the calls, something deliberate, almost ritualistic, that made her skin crawl. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant for her, and her alone. That night, she stayed up late, determined to ignore the call if it came again. But when the clock struck 12, the phone remained silent. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe whoever was behind this had gotten bored. But then, at 12:01, The phone rang. By the third night, Anna was exhausted. The calls had become a twisted routine, a dark ritual she couldn't escape. Each time, the breathing was the same, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly familiar. The background noise had grown clearer too. The hum of an engine, the faint screech of tires, the occasional crackle of static. It was like listening to a recording of a car ride, but one that felt hauntingly personal. She couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, she called her friend Mark, who worked in IT and had a knack for figuring things out. She didn't tell him everything, just that she'd been getting strange calls from an unknown number and wanted to trace it. Mark agreed to help, though he sounded skeptical. "Probably just a spam bot," he said, "but I'll see what I can do." Anna sent him the number and waited, her nerves frayed. She tried to distract herself with work, but her mind kept drifting back to the calls. That sound in the background. Why did it feel so familiar? It gnawed at her, a puzzle she couldn't solve. When Mark called back that afternoon, his tone was different. Gone was the casual skepticism, replaced by a cautious curiosity. "Anna," he said slowly, "where did you get this number?" Her stomach dropped. "Why? What did you find?" "It's weird. The number is registered, but it's not active. It was deactivated 2 years ago." "What do you mean, deactivated?" "I mean, it's not supposed to be in use. The carrier shut it down." But here's the really strange part. It was registered to someone named Daniel Carter. The name hit her like a punch to the chest. Daniel. Her husband. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Daniel's phone was destroyed in the accident. It's gone." "I know," Mark said, his voice softening. "That's why this doesn't make sense. Are you sure it's the same number?" Anna didn't answer. She didn't need to. She knew it was his number. She had dialed it countless times in the days after the accident, hoping against hope that he would answer. But he never did. And now, 2 years later, it was calling her. She thanked Mark and hung up, her mind reeling. This wasn't just a prank or a glitch. This was something else, something she couldn't explain. She thought about the sounds in the background, the hum of the engine, the screech of tires. And then it hit her. The accident. Daniel had died in a car crash. He had been on the phone with her when it happened. She remembered the call vividly. The sudden noise, the panic in his voice, the deafening crash. And then silence. She had replayed that moment in her head 1,000 times, torturing herself with the what-ifs. What if she had said something different? What if she had kept him on the line a little longer? What if she could have done something to stop it? Now, it felt like that moment was being played back to her, night after night, in fragments she couldn't piece together. But why? What was it trying to tell her? That night, she didn't wait for the call. She sat by the phone, her heart pounding, and when it rang at exactly midnight, she answered without hesitation. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" For the first time, the breathing stopped. There was a moment of silence, so profound it felt like the world had stopped turning. And then, faintly, she heard it, a voice, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Anna." The sound of her name, spoken in that voice, sent a shiver through her entire body. It was him. It was Daniel. But how? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers, but all she could do was sit there, clutching the phone, her breath caught in her throat. "Daniel," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "What's happening? Why are you calling me?" The line crackled, and for a moment, she thought she had lost him. But then the voice returned, faint and fragmented, as if coming from a great distance. "Help me," he said, the words barely audible. "It wasn't an accident." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What wasn't an accident?" The breathing returned, heavier now, more urgent. The background noise grew louder. The hum of the engine, the screech of tires, the sound of glass shattering. It was like listening to the accident all over again. But this time, she could hear something else. A voice, faint and distorted, shouting in the background. A man's voice, but not Daniel's. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "Daniel. Who else is there?" The line went dead. Anna sat there, staring at the phone, her mind spinning. It wasn't an accident. The words echoed in her head, over and over, like a mantra. If it wasn't an accident, then what was it? And who was the other voice? She spent the next day in a daze, unable to focus on anything but the call. She tried to convince herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her, a desperate attempt to make sense of her grief. But deep down, she knew it was real. Daniel was trying to tell her something, and she couldn't ignore it. That night, she didn't wait for the call. She dialed the number herself, her hands trembling as she pressed the buttons. It rang once, twice, and then a voice answered, not Daniel's, but a robotic recording. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. She tried again and again, but the result was the same. The number was dead, just as Mark had said, and yet, at midnight, it would call her. It made no sense, but nothing about this did. When the call came that night, she was ready. She answered immediately, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Daniel, I'm here," she said. "Tell me what happened. Tell me who did this to you." The breathing was louder now, more frantic. The background noise was clearer too, the engine, the tires, the crash. And then, faintly, she heard it again. The other voice. This time, she could make out a few words. "Watch out!" the voice shouted, followed by a loud bang. And then, silence. Anna sat there, her mind racing. The voice had sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. She replayed the call in her head, trying to remember every detail. The engine, the tires, the crash. It was all there, just like in the accident. But the other voice, that was new, and it changed everything. Anna couldn't sleep. The voice from the call haunted her, echoing in her mind like a ghost she couldn't exorcise. It wasn't just Daniel's voice anymore. It was the other voice, the one shouting in the background. She knew she had heard it before. But where? And why did it feel so important? The next morning, she dug through old boxes she hadn't touched since the accident. There were photos, letters, and a few keepsakes she had tucked away, unable to part with but too painful to display. Among them was Daniel's old laptop, which she hadn't opened in years. She powered it on, her hands shaking as she typed in the password, their anniversary date. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she scrolled through his files anyway, hoping for some clue. Emails, photos, documents. Nothing stood out until she found a folder labeled Work. Inside were notes from a project Daniel had been working on before he died. He had been investigating financial irregularities at his company, and the notes were detailed, almost obsessive. Names, dates, amounts, it was all there. And then she saw it. A name she recognized. Gregory Hayes. Her blood ran cold. Greg had been Daniel's colleague and friend. He had even been at the funeral, offering his condolences with a solemn face. But according to Daniel's notes, Greg was involved in something far darker, embezzlement, fraud, and possibly worse. Daniel had been close to uncovering the truth, and then, the accident. Anna's mind raced. The voice on the call, it was Greg's. She was sure of it now. He had been there that night, in the car with Daniel. But why? And what had really happened? That night, she waited for the call, her heart pounding in her chest. When the phone rang at midnight, she answered immediately. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady. "I know about Greg. Tell me what to do." The breathing on the other end was ragged, almost frantic. The background noise was clearer than ever. The engine, the tires, the crash. And then, faintly, she heard Daniel's voice. "Proof," he whispered. "Find the proof." The line went dead. The next day, Anna went to the police. She handed over Daniel's laptop and explained everything. The calls, the voice, the notes. At first, they were skeptical, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. They reopened the case, and within weeks, Greg was arrested. The trial was swift, and the truth finally came out. Greg had been trying to silence Daniel that night, and the accident had been anything but accidental. After the trial, the calls stopped. Anna never heard from Daniel again, but she didn't need to. She had found the truth, and that was enough. Still, sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would glance at the phone, half expecting it to ring. And though it never did, she felt a strange sense of peace. Daniel had reached out to her from beyond, not to haunt her, but to guide her. And in the end, she had done what he asked. She had found the proof. It started as any rain would, soft droplets tapping against rooftops, swelling into a steady rhythm that washed the dirt roads of the village. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of damp earth. At first, the residents welcomed it, grateful for relief from an unusually dry season. Fields were quenched, streams swelled, and even the birds seemed to sing louder beneath the gray skies. Days passed, and the rain showed no sign of stopping. What began as refreshing soon grew tiresome. Clothes hung out to dry remained heavy with water, and the streets turned to muddy streams. Farmers, who had initially celebrated the rainfall, grew uneasy as their fields became swamps. Yet, the rain was just rain, or so they thought. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. A strange static in the sound of the rain, like whispers tangled in the downpour. A shadow moving where none should be, just at the edge of vision. No one spoke of these things, dismissing them as tricks of the mind. But unease settled over the village like the dark clouds above. The rain pressed on, day after day, and a creeping realization began to sink in. It wasn't going to stop. As the rain persisted, the village adjusted to its unyielding presence. Roofs were reinforced to withstand the constant battering, and trenches were dug to divert water from homes. Despite these efforts, the rain seeped into every crevice, saturating not only the soil but the spirits of the people. It was during this time that the stories began to surface, half-whispered accounts of strange occurrences. A woman claimed to see a figure standing at the edge of her flooded field, unmoving and indistinct in the heavy downpour. When she looked again, it was gone. Another villager swore he heard his name called from outside his window late at night. The voice faint but insistent, carried by the rhythm of the rain. The whispers spread, creating a tension that permeated every conversation. People began avoiding the outdoors unless absolutely necessary, retreating into the safety of their homes. But even indoors, the rain seemed to intrude, its relentless sound masking the usual comforts of familiarity. The village square, once lively, now stood empty. Streets that had echoed with the laughter of children became eerily silent, save for the ceaseless drumming of water on cobblestones. The rain was no longer a simple inconvenience. It was an oppressive force, one that seemed to watch and wait. At night, the unease grew sharper. Shapes flickered at the edges of lantern light, and the persistent whispers became harder to dismiss. Those who tried to sleep found their dreams invaded by shadowy figures and endless rain, leaving them unrest and wary. By the end of the second week, the villagers were no longer merely adapting. They were enduring, clinging to the hope that the rain, like all things, would eventually pass. The third week of rain brought more than just water. The ground, now saturated beyond its limits, began to give way in places. Small landslides tumbled down the hills that framed the village, and the river swelled dangerously close to breaching its banks. The air grew heavier, laden not only with moisture, but with an unshakable sense of dread. People spoke even less now, their conversations clipped and focused on immediate needs. There was little room for pleasantries when each passing day threatened greater losses. Yet, beneath the surface of practical concerns, a shared unease festered. Each villager carried their own version of the same question. Why had the rain not stopped? It was an elder, a reclusive man who lived on the outskirts of the village, who finally broke the silence. He arrived at the tavern one evening, his cloak soaked and his face pale. The few gathered there turned to him in surprise, for he was rarely seen in public, much less during such weather. He spoke in a low, trembling voice, recounting a story that sent chills through those present. Decades ago, the village had been the site of a peculiar ritual, performed by a group of settlers who had since disappeared. They had sought to contain something. He did not know what, that they believed was tied to the land itself. The ritual had required secrecy, but it had left behind scars. A ruined stone altar deep in the woods, and whispered warnings to avoid disturbing it. The elder's words stirred memories in some of the older villagers, fragments of tales half-remembered from their youth. They spoke of children warned not to wander too far into the forest, of strange symbols carved into trees that no one could explain. As the rain battered the windows of the tavern, an unspoken fear gripped the room. What if the ritual had failed? Or worse, what if something had disrupted it? The next day, a small group of villagers, driven by desperation, decided to investigate the ruins. Among them was the narrator, who felt a grim compulsion to uncover the truth. Armed with lanterns and wrapped in layers against the unyielding rain, they set out into the forest. The path was treacherous, the ground slick with mud and the rain obscuring their vision. But as they pressed deeper, an eerie stillness seemed to settle around them. The rain no longer felt natural. It was a presence, heavy and watching. When they reached the ruins, they found the altar exactly as the elder had described: broken, moss-covered, and etched with symbols long eroded by time. Yet, there was something new. A faint glow emanating from the cracks in the stone, pulsing like a heartbeat. One of the villagers, braver or perhaps more foolish than the rest, reached out to touch the altar. As their fingers brushed the surface, the rain seemed to change. It grew louder, more insistent, as though furious. The whispers, once faint and sporadic, rose into a cacophony. The group fled, their lanterns casting wild shadows as they stumbled back through the forest. But the rain followed them, its presence no longer subtle. It was alive, and it was angry. Returning to the village brought little comfort. The rain had grown fiercer during their absence, pounding against rooftops and cascading down the streets in torrents. The group that had ventured into the woods said little of what they had seen. Their expressions, pale and haunted, spoke volumes, and whispers of their journey spread quickly. The glowing cracks in the altar became the subject of speculation. Some believed it was the source of the rain, a kind of breach through which an ancient force was leaking. Others thought the glow was a warning, a signal that whatever the settlers had sought to contain was waking. No one knew for certain, and the uncertainty gnawed at the villagers' frayed nerves. The rain was no longer simply a downpour. It was a torment. The river breached its banks that night, swallowing homes on its edges. Livestock drowned, fields vanished beneath water, and the once cozy homes of the villagers became damp prisons. But worse than the physical destruction was the growing presence that accompanied the rain. By now, the whispers were impossible to ignore. They came not only at night, but in the daylight hours as well, soft yet persistent. Some claimed they recognized the voices, long-dead relatives, lost friends, calling to them from the rain. A few, overwhelmed by the compulsion to respond, stepped out into the storm and never returned. The narrator, unable to sleep and burdened by the memory of the glowing altar, began piecing together what little history he could. The elder had mentioned that the ritual was meant to bind something, but there had been no mention of what would happen if it were disturbed. The symbols carved into the trees near the altar had been deliberate, warnings to keep others away. The whispers were not the only thing the rain carried. Shapes began to emerge, more defined than before. Shadowy figures moved in the periphery of vision, vanishing the moment they were fully seen. Their presence felt predatory, as if they were circling, waiting. Desperation gripped the narrator. If the rain was tied to the altar, there had to be a way to seal it once more. He revisited the elder, pressing for more information. The old man was reluctant, but eventually revealed what he knew. The settlers' ritual had been written down, though the details were incomplete. It required both the symbols carved into the trees and a human offering, the nature of which had been deliberately left vague. The idea of a sacrifice, even to save the village, was unthinkable. Yet, the alternative, the rain continuing until nothing remained, seemed worse. The village was unraveling. Days and nights blurred together under the unending gray skies. Homes collapsed under the weight of waterlogged roofs, and the streets had turned into rivers of mud. Those who had resisted the whispers now barricaded themselves indoors, while others had vanished into the rain's grasp, their names muttered with dread by those who remained. The narrator felt the weight of responsibility pressing down like the rain itself. If the altar had been the source of the storm, it had to be the key to ending it. The elders' fragmented knowledge of the ritual provided a faint glimmer of hope, but it was shrouded in uncertainty. The original settlers had left no detailed records, only cryptic warnings and vague allusions to a sacrifice. Gathering a small group of the bravest villagers, the narrator shared his plan. It was risky, desperate even, but they had no other options. With lanterns, tools, and the scraps of knowledge provided by the elder, they ventured once more into the forest. The journey was even more treacherous than before. The rain fell with a vengeful force, making the narrow path slippery and dangerous. The forest seemed alive, its trees creaking and groaning as if warning them to turn back. Shapes flitted between the trunks, closer now, their forms nearly solid in the dim lantern light. When they reached the ruins, the glowing cracks in the altar were brighter, pulsating with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the rain. The group spread out, carving the settlers' ancient symbols into nearby trees with trembling hands. The narrator worked at the altar itself, tracing the patterns etched into its surface and filling in gaps with what they could decipher. As the ritual took shape, the rain began to change. It grew heavier, if that were possible, and the whispers surged into a deafening roar. The shapes in the shadows moved closer, circling the group as they worked. Fear gripped them, but stopping now was unthinkable. The final step was unclear, but the mention of a sacrifice hung heavily in the air. The narrator hesitated, unsure what form the offering needed to take. Then, one of the group, a young man whose wife and children had vanished in the flood, stepped forward. His expression was resolute, his eyes fixed on the altar. Before anyone could stop him, he placed his hand on the glowing surface. A burst of light erupted, blinding the group and forcing them to shield their eyes. The rain seemed to pause for a fraction of a second, the world holding its breath. When the light faded, the young man was gone, and the glow in the altar had vanished. The rain's intensity lessened, the pounding turning to a gentle patter. The forest fell silent, and for the first time in weeks, the villagers felt the weight of the storm lift. The rain stopped the following morning, leaving the village shrouded in a heavy mist. The silence was overwhelming after weeks of relentless noise, as if the land itself held its breath. Water pooled in the streets, glistening under a pale sky, while fields lay in ruin, their crops drowned and rotting. The villagers emerged from their homes cautiously, their faces marked by exhaustion and disbelief. They stared at the sky, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. The storm had ended, but at what cost? No one spoke of the young man who had vanished during the ritual. His name lingered in their minds, a memory too raw to confront. The forest remained an unspoken boundary. None dared to revisit the ruins, though some whispered that the altar had cracked completely, its remnants buried beneath mud and roots. Whatever had been sealed, or freed, was beyond their comprehension. The glowing light was gone, but the air still carried a subtle tension, as though the rain had left behind an imprint that would never fully fade. The narrator, now back in his home, struggled to process the events. The sacrifice had worked, if that was even the right word. The village was no longer drowning, yet its spirit felt fractured. As he walked through the streets, the signs of survival were everywhere. Neighbors helping to rebuild, salvaging what little remained. But the smiles were forced, and the laughter had a hollow edge. At night, sleep came reluctantly. The memory of the rain lingered, its whispers replaying in his mind. He wondered if they would ever truly escape its grip. What had the settlers intended with their ritual? Had their act been one of containment or desperation? And most troubling of all, had the villagers truly sealed something away, or had they merely appeased it for a time? Weeks later, as the land began to dry and the river receded, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yet, small signs hinted at something unresolved. Animals avoided the forest entirely, their behavior skittish and erratic. A child claimed to hear faint whispers on particularly humid nights, though her parents dismissed it as imagination. The narrator couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had been a warning, not an isolated event. The sacrifice had brought peace, but peace felt fragile, as though it balanced on the edge of something unknowable. He often found himself staring toward the forest, where the ruins lay hidden beneath a canopy of trees and shadows. The rain had stopped, but the village would never forget its weight. And deep down, the narrator suspected the storm wasn't truly gone. It was simply waiting,